This is a review of the causes of the Russian Revolution. So, throughout this Google Slides presentation, we will be reviewing the major causes of the Russian Revolution so that we can kind of understand what caused this major event in Western civilization. So, let's start first with the political causes. So, remember, when we talk about political causes, we are talking about problems or issues that were going on with Russia's government at that time. So, Russia's government at the time leading up to 1905 was an absolute monarchy. So, what that means is that the king or the czar, which was the term they used for the Russian king, at this time, had all of the power, and it was believed that that power came from God. And so there were many institutions in Russia at the time that helped back up the czar's power. So, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church. The czar was the head of the church, and this entity reinforced his power by basically saying that all of his decrees came directly from God. He also had a secret police known as the Okhrana, who could come and basically arrest anyone who spoke out against him and basically make those people disappear. So we're not talking about a legitimate police force where the people have certain rights, where people know what they're being arrested for. This was a police force that could show up and just basically grab you. Censorship was also practiced by the czar. So basically, he tried to keep out any ideas that would go against his rule. The legal system also helped him. It was easy for him to once again arrest and sentence his enemies to, for example, exile in Siberia. He also had a massive army, the biggest in Europe at the time, which allowed him to put down any revolts or rebellions. And so basically, what this meant is that the people of Russia had no rights, no democracy, no representation, no freedom of speech, freedom of press, any of that stuff that we've talked about previously. The Russian people did not have it. So, who was our czar at the time of the Russian Revolution? So, the Romanovs were the family that had been in power for hundreds of years in Russia, but the current czar that we want to talk about is Nicholas II. He ruled alone and unquestioned, and he had lots of military power from what were called the Cossacks, which were these peasants that were known for their fighting skills, known for being very fearsome. Many of Nicholas's guards were Cossacks. He, as a young boy, had been very quiet, very shy, very compassionate, and this actually caused him a lot of anxiety because his dad often mocked him for it. He married for love, which was very uncommon for the time period. Usually, when political leaders got married, it was an alliance, but he married Alexandra, who, as you can see, is pictured right there. And the problem with this marriage, like he loved her, we have lots of love letters between the two, was that Alexandra was very unpopular with the Russian people. She was a foreign queen. She was born in Germany, raised most of her life in England, did not speak Russian, was not a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, and was painfully shy. And so, because of that, that made her very, very unpopular with Russian people because they took the shyness not as, oh, she's shy, it gives her anxiety to come out to see us. They took it as she doesn't care about us. She's uncaring. She doesn't even want to give time of day to her people. As for Nicholas's personality, he was very weak and indecisive. He hated conflict, and he would often go out to the countryside to avoid major decisions. Think about that's not the type of ruler you want when you've got a crisis situation. And we're going to see that Russia was having lots of problems at this time. So Nicholas came to power in 1894 when his dad died of kidney disease. And so he's going to be at the helm when the revolution breaks out. So he is not inherently a bad guy. He's just the wrong guy at the wrong time. Now, on top of that, we have problem with the heir to the throne. So at that time, there's a little boy named Alexei, and he is the heir to the throne. He's next in line to become czar after Nicholas steps down or dies. And the problem with him is he is a very sick little boy. He has hemophilia, and so the slightest cut or bruise could kill him. And so the continuation of the monarchy is very unstable at this time as well. And Alexei will be a distraction for his parents. They're constantly going to be looking for ways to help him. They're concerned parents who don't want their son to die. They also have four daughters who are Olga, Maria, Tatiana, and Anastasia. And so they have this very nice little family. We have videos of them going out and doing all things families do. And we're going to see that it does not end well for this family. And out of the daughters, the most famous is Anastasia. And we'll talk more about her and why she is so famous later on. So, on top of the government not being the best government, an absolute monarchy with no rights, and a leader who is not very good to deal with a crisis situation, we also have an army that is a mess. It was very backwards. It was huge. It was the biggest army in Europe, but it wasn't well equipped, and we'll talk about why in a minute. It was not properly trained, and it had really bad generals. Generals that were not necessarily suited for the job with little knowledge of modern tactics. And then our common soldiers were conscripted, so they were forced to serve in the military, hence why the military was so big. And the lower classes resented this because the upper classes had ways of getting out of it versus the lower classes did not. All of this would culminate and really show why this was such a problem with the Russo-Japanese War that broke out in 1904 and lasts until 1905. So this was a very unpopular war, which Russia lost. Basically, what Russia was trying to do at the time was to build a Trans-Siberian Railroad. Nicholas had moved troops into Mongolia and then was looking to annex Manchuria. And you can see here's where they were building the railroad. But basically, they ran into conflict with Japan because Japan, who had expanded into Korea, now also wanted Manchuria. And by the way, Manchuria was China's territory at this time, but nobody invited China to the war. And so at first, people unified around this in Russia and were excited. But basically, as supplies became strained and Russia lost battle after battle, it was an embarrassing loss. It was humiliating, and it made many people turn against the Tsar. Now, added to this, so we've got our government, our political problems, our military problems. We also have economic problems at this time. So, Russia at this time was mostly agricultural. Out of 127 million Russians, 115 of them were farmers. And you would think that's good. Okay, you can grow lots of food, you could sell it, but it wasn't great at the time. The farmers were not using the best practices. They had not adapted to more modern practices. And so, what that meant is they're not growing enough food. And so, starvation was very common, especially among the lower classes. And so, this was a huge problem as food was very scarce. As most people were still farmers, that meant that Russia had not fully industrialized. Now, in some areas like St. Petersburg, which we're going to find out is a very important city, and we're going to talk about it, we'll see how it changes names a bunch of times, Kiev and Moscow, there was some industrialization, but it wasn't on a level that we'd seen in other countries previously. And so, because of this, Russia was not able to produce enough materials. To give you a number, between 1890 and 1899, factory output had only increased by 8% in Russia. And so, once again, Russia was not fully industrialized, was not able to produce enough goods for its people or to sell and make money. On top of that, the working conditions for those who did work in the factories were awful. 12 to 16-hour days, they were unsanitary, they were dangerous, and many people couldn't make enough money, would actually sleep on the floor of the factory. So that's actually what that picture is right there. On top of that, there were very, very heavy taxes, and these were mostly paid by the lower classes who were already living horrible lives with a lack of food and in poverty. So you can see that the economic situation was not very good in Russia at this time. Now, also, we have many social problems. Religious discrimination in Russia was common. Basically, in the late 1800s, czars had enforced a policy of Russification where they would force people to become more Russian to unite the many different ethnicities in Russia. And so, one of the ways they would do this is they only allowed people to be members of the Russian Orthodox Church. And basically, what this led to were these violent attacks against the Jews. They're known as pogroms, and they basically began in the late 1800s, and they're going to continue into the 1900s. There's a big one in 1902, 1903, and so on, and even after World War I. So when we get to talking about the Holocaust, remember there was a history of anti-Semitism, so violence and discrimination against the Jews, even before Hitler came to power. Ethnic discrimination was also common. So the Russian people were not united. Russification tried to make them all speak one language and adopt one culture, but basically what that led to is animosity among different minorities. And we see this growing independence movement, not wanting to be part of Russia, but to form their own independent countries. Also, the unfair social hierarchy was a very big problem. It was very much based on feudalism and had not changed much, even though we get the growth of a middle class in Russia. So basically, with this social hierarchy, there was a growing gap between the rich and the poor. And even though serfs had been freed in 1861, they were still stuck on their land. So the peasants were stuck on their land, stuck in debt, and had no way to improve their lives. And they were basically supporting all of society. And so we'll see that that is going to lead to a lot of animosity, and many of our revolutionaries want to fix that. Add to that the fact that the Russian calendar is out of date, and that's just super frustrating for studying the Russian Revolution. Russia was 13 days off the rest of the world. And to give you an idea of how much they were behind the times, Spain and Italy changed from the Julian calendar, which Russia was still on, to the Gregorian calendar in 1582. Remember, the time period we're talking about is 1905. Russia had not adapted or changed that at all. And it's just another example of how backwards Russia was at this time. So something to kind of clue you in to how we've seen these ideas before is looking at these two political cartoons. So on the left-hand side, we have a cartoon from Russia, and we see the social hierarchy. So we can see at the top, there is the Tsar and the Tsarina, and it says, we rule over you. We govern you. So those are the members of the nobility. Okay. Then we have, we pray for you. So we see the Russian Orthodox Church. And then we have, we shoot you. So the Russian military. We eat for you. So once again, our upper class. And look at who's being crushed under the plate here, our lower classes, our peasants and our workers. And we can see people are dying and collapsing. And we get the idea that this group at the bottom can no longer support the rest of Russian society. And on the right, there is our cartoon from the French Revolution. Remember the first unit that we looked at. And we can see a lot of parallels between these two cartoons. So because of all of these problems, we're going to have the growth of the intelligentsia, which was the educated Russian class that basically wanted to solve all of Russia's problems. So just like in France, how you get early revolutionaries who were reacting to the problems and basically saying, hey, we can fix these problems with new ideas. And we can look to, for example, the Enlightenment. We can look to Western traditions. We can look to Karl Marx and his ideas of communism. And so basically, the intelligentsia were all united in their thoughts that they wanted to fix Russia's problems. However, they disagreed over how to change Russia's government. And the big disagreement was between things like democracy and republic, and then the ideas of communism and the idea of voting versus non-voting. So basically, how much of a say do we want to give the people? So communism had come into Russia early on, and one of the major communists in Russia was this guy named Vladimir Lenin. That wasn't his birth name. He actually changed his name to Vladimir Lenin later on. And Lenin was born in 1870 and basically was inspired to become a revolutionary when his brother was hanged for being involved with a plot to assassinate Nicholas II's dad, Alexander III. And so this kind of inspired him to try to topple Russia's government. And so basically his life is a history of being arrested, exiled to Siberia, and then fleeing to escape arrest once again by the Russian secret police, the Okhrana. So he lived in Switzerland, England, Germany, and Austria. And basically in 1903, he's going to lead to a major split in the Communist Party in Russia. And so we'll get one group, which are the Bolsheviks, which are the group that supported Vladimir Lenin. They wanted radical change. They wanted it now. They were willing to use violence to achieve their changes. And they wanted a communist elite to run the government. So Lenin basically argued that democracy, letting average people vote, was not good because you needed an elite group who understood the beliefs of communism and would make the best decisions for the people. The other group was the Mensheviks, and these were communists who did not support Lenin. They wanted slow, peaceful change and wanted a democratic government, one where people could vote. Now, the Bolsheviks, so basically Lenin named both of these parties, and the reason why he was able to do that was at the time he controlled the communist newspapers. And so he called the Bolsheviks the majority. And the Mensheviks, that word means minority. Now, the thing here is that actually most people were Mensheviks, not Bolsheviks, but it gives you the idea of how Lenin used propaganda to make it seem like his party was the more supported party. So all of this is going to lead up to 1905, where we're going to get our first phase of the Russian Revolution. So we'll see throughout this revolution, and there will be 3 different phases, how our revolutionaries are going to try to basically deal with many of these problems, and we'll see how the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks play a major role in the Russian Revolution.